You are seated at a banquet table, the air heavy with incense and roasted meat. The laughter of courtiers ripples around you, but your eyes are fixed on her, a woman whose skin has grown pale as marble, whose lips no longer breathe, yet whose presence commands the room. You are expected to bow. You are expected to toast. You are expected to pretend she is alive. Before we descend into the shadows of Rome's strangest imperial ritual, I want to welcome you to this journey. If you're watching from London, Lahore, Lisbon, or Lagos, take a moment and let us know where in the world you are joining from. It never ceases to amaze me that across continents and time zones, a community can gather around the same story, pulled into the same dark corridors of history. If you find yourself drawn deeper with each step, consider leaving a like and subscribing, so that together we can continue unearthing the echoes of the past. The story begins with death, but not an ordinary death. Poppaea Sabina, the Empress of Rome, lay broken after a violent quarrel with her husband. The sources whisper that Nero, in one of his rages, struck her with such force that life fled from her and the unborn child within her womb. She was beauty incarnate, celebrated for her elegance, despised for her ambition, and now, suddenly, she was silent. For most men, grief is an abyss. For Nero, grief was an obstacle. And obstacles were meant to be conquered. The emperor refused to surrender her to the pyres. He ordered her body embalmed, an Egyptian practice alien to Roman custom. Oils, resins, spices, her form was preserved not for burial, but for eternity. Her bedchamber remained sealed as though she might return at any hour. Curtains hung in stillness, silks glimmered faintly in the lamplight, and the faint perfume of frankincense lingered on air that no longer moved with her breath. The empire moved forward, yet Nero's palace became a mausoleum, a place where time itself bent to the will of one man's obsession. Imagine the courtiers summoned to dine in the presence of their emperor. The hall blazed with torches, bronze dishes reflected the flames, music threaded softly through the air. And there, raised upon a dais enshrined in glass, lay the Empress, silent among the living. Her skin waxen, her eyes closed as though in sleep, her beauty suspended between life and death. Did the senators avert their eyes, afraid to be caught staring at what should not be seen? Did the musicians falter, their strings trembling as the emperor lifted a cup to his silent bride? Nero's voice carried across the room. "She hears me still," he declared, his tone not daring contradiction. "Rome is hers as much as mine." To challenge him was to risk one's life, and so the lie became ritual. Toasts were raised to the absent empress. Servants laid out plates of delicacies at her side. A world empire bowed its head to a corpse. What did it mean for Rome when the emperor could not let go of the dead? Was this love, or was it tyranny cloaked in mourning? The line blurred. For Nero, Poppaea was not gone. She was a canvas upon which he painted his defiance of nature. For Rome, it was a warning. If an emperor could command death itself, what hope was left for the living? Yet the body, though embalmed, could not remain unchanged. Even resins and spices could not halt time forever. The longer the ritual continued, the more grotesque the illusion became. Her skin tightened, her features sharpened into something skeletal. Curtains had to be drawn closer, incense burned thicker. The corpse became less a wife than a shrine, less a woman than an emblem of one man's refusal to accept what had passed. But obsession, once rooted, never lies still. Nero's need for Poppaea did not fade with the fading of her image. Instead, it grew restless, searching for new vessels. The courtiers began to whisper. He sought not simply to preserve her, but to resurrect her. In dreams, he called for her. In waking life, his gaze wandered through the palace gardens, across the marble baths, through the crowded slave markets, hunting for a face, a gesture, a shadow that might conjure her again. And then, one evening, amid the torches and murmurs of the court, he saw him. A boy, slight, delicate, with eyes that seemed to echo hers. The resemblance was enough to halt Nero mid-step, enough to summon him closer, to trace with his gaze every line of youth, every soft curve, every suggestion of a vanished empress. The boy's name was Sporus. Nero's grief, embalmed and perfumed, had found its next stage, and for Rome, the most grotesque act of imperial substitution was about to begin. The court fell silent when Nero's gaze fixed upon the boy. Torches guttered along the walls of the palace, their smoke curling upward like prayers that no god dared answer. Sporus stood alone before the emperor, his bare feet pressed into the cool marble, his thin frame trembling against the weight of imperial attention. He was young, scarcely more than a teenager, a freedman of little renown, yet something about his face made the emperor rise from his seat. It was not the strength of his body nor the wit of his speech. It was his eyes, eyes that mirrored the lost empress, eyes that whispered of Poppaea. Sabina returned from the grave. Nero moved closer. His robes trailed behind him, embroidered with threads of gold that caught the torchlight. He circled the boy, studying him like a sculptor before an unfinished block of marble. "He has her softness," Nero murmured, his words half to himself, half to the trembling courtiers who dared not meet his gaze. Her gaze, her gentleness. The emperor reached out, his hand hovering just short of Sporus's cheek, a gesture both tender and predatory. In that moment, Sporus ceased to be a person. He became a canvas, a vessel, a shadow through which a dead woman might walk again. The orders were given in hushed tones, spoken in corridors where echoes quickly died. Physicians and surgeons were summoned, their faces pale as they were commanded to unmake what nature had made. Rome's laws forbade castration, but Nero's will was the only law that mattered. Sporus was led away into chambers where the air stank of iron and smoke, where sharp instruments gleamed in the lamplight. The boy's cries, muffled behind heavy doors, carried into the silence of the palace like the lament of some doomed sacrifice. When he emerged, he was no longer whole. His body had been altered, reshaped to fit the emperor's vision, carved into the outline of another's absence. Silks replaced his tunic. Jewels weighed down his slight frame. Servants painted his lips with color, arranged his hair in the style of Poppaea, and draped veils across his face. Step by step, gesture by gesture, Sporus was taught to embody the ghost of the Empress. The courtiers bowed as he entered, but their eyes slid away quickly, ashamed to look too closely at what he had become. For to look was to acknowledge the cruelty made flesh before them. And Nero? He was entranced. In public, he paraded Sporus at his side, cloaked in imperial garments, introduced as his bride. In private, he whispered to him as though speaking to Poppaea herself. "You have returned to me," he would murmur, his voice heavy with intoxicated longing. "Rome could not take you. Not even death could keep you from my side." Sporus was compelled to answer in silence, his very existence twisted into a living response. The Roman people watched in horror and fascination. The story spread across taverns and marketplaces. Their emperor had wed a boy, declaring him the Empress reborn. Some sneered that Sporus was less a man, less even than a slave. He was an echo, a puppet, a mirror held up to the emperor's madness. Others pitied him, whispering that his fate was more tragic than any gladiator's death. But none dared speak too loudly. Rome was an empire built on silence as much as on stone. Yet the ceremonies continued. A wedding procession was arranged, complete with veils, torches, and solemn vows. Senators stood as witnesses, their faces carefully blank. The priests invoked the gods, though even they must have wondered what divinity could sanctify such a union. And Sporus, clothed in the empress's robes, was led through the rites like a lamb through ritual slaughter. His name no longer mattered. He was Poppaea, because the emperor commanded it. But beneath the glittering pageantry, there lingered an unspoken question. What did Sporus see when he looked into the polished bronze mirrors of the palace? Did he recognize himself in the painted face staring back? Or did he see only a stranger, a mask crafted by another man's grief and obsession? The silence of history offers no answer, only the haunting image of a boy forced to wear the skin of a ghost. For Nero, it was triumph. His love resurrected, his empire bent to his delusion. For Sporus, it was captivity without chains, a theft not of wealth or liberty, but of self. And though the boy endured, standing at the emperor's side as Rome looked on, the shadow of what awaited him was already beginning to lengthen. The day would come when the spectacle would turn upon him, when the ghost he was forced to embody would lead him not to survival, but to destruction. The palace torches flared as the wedding feast began, music rising to mask the unspoken horror. Yet, somewhere, in the hollow silence behind Sporus's eyes, the truth waited, unchanging, unbearable, and inescapable. Nero had not resurrected Poppaea. He had only created a living tomb, and Rome itself was forced to watch. Rome had devoured emperors before, and it devoured Nero too. His suicide was not a clean ending, but a rupture, a wound that bled chaos across the empire. In the days and months that followed, palaces shifted hands like dice in a gambler's palm, loyalties splintered, and oaths were broken with the ease of dry twigs. Soldiers sold their allegiance to the highest bidder, senators swore fidelity only to revoke it, and the empire itself seemed to wobble between collapse and reinvention. But amid the swirl of battles and betrayals, one figure lingered on, a figure too strange to be forgotten, too valuable to be ignored. Sporus remained. He was not emperor, nor soldier, nor senator, but something far more unsettling, a living relic of Nero's madness. His body bore the mark of the emperor's will, his identity carved into a grotesque monument of grief and desire. Where others saw a fragile young man, those who ruled saw instead a trophy, an ornament infused with the memory of the Empress who had died, and of the emperor who had sought to bring her back through flesh not her own. First, he was taken by Otho. Otho, who had once been Poppaea's husband before Nero had stolen her away, must have felt a bitter, mocking satisfaction. To possess the boy shaped into her likeness was a victory more pointed than any military conquest. Was it a gesture of rivalry beyond the grave? Did Otho parade Sporus not out of affection, but as a taunt to Nero's ghost, declaring that even in death he could repossess what Nero had stolen? History does not say, but the irony must have been sharp, a cruel joke played across the emperor's corpse. Then came Vitellius. His reign was brief but drenched in violence, a storm that burned itself out in gluttony and excess. Vitellius did not merely rule Rome, he consumed it. His appetite was insatiable, his taste for cruelty sharper than wine on the tongue. And so, when Sporus passed into his possession, it was not as an heirloom of legitimacy or a shadow of Poppaea's beauty. It was as a toy, a living jest, a morsel of theater to be chewed before the eyes of the mob. It was with Vitellius that the charade turned toward its darkest stage. Among his many entertainments, one plan emerged more grotesque than all the rest. Sporus would be led into the arena, not as a gladiator, trained to kill or be killed, not as a criminal, sentenced to die before the eyes of the people. No, he would be led as a bride. Before the roaring mob, Sporus would be veiled, adorned in bridal robes, transformed once more into the echo of an empress. And there, on the sand of the Colosseum, he would be wedded not to Nero, not to Otho, but to death itself. The plan spread through the city like wildfire. In the bathhouses, where steam curled around marble columns, men whispered of the grotesque ceremony to come. In the markets, amid the clamor of fishmongers and fruit sellers, rumors trickled like spilled wine. Beneath the colonnades, where philosophers debated and beggars lingered, the whispers hardened into anticipation. The mockery of a marriage would be staged before thousands, a parody of union, a cruel inversion of ritual. Was it comedy? Was it tragedy? For the mob, it scarcely mattered. Rome craved spectacle more than it craved bread, and humiliation was its richest spice. The greater the shame, the louder the applause. And Sporus, the boy-turned-empress, the unwilling bride, was to become the centerpiece of a feast of cruelty. What did Sporus feel in those days of waiting? We cannot know the exact moment he grasped the shape of what was to come, but we can imagine the dread gathering like thunder behind his ribs. He had been a boy once, his future his own. Then Nero's gaze had stripped him of it. He had been altered, clothed, and paraded as a woman he had never been. His life had become performance, each breath choreographed for the pleasure of emperors. And now, at the edge of years, that performance was to end in parody, his dignity offered up to the sand and the roar of Rome's appetite. Perhaps he recalled the corridors of Nero's palace, the smell of incense burning heavy in the air, the silk veils laid across his shoulders, the cold touch of physicians' tools. Perhaps he remembered the laughter of courtiers as they bowed to him, pretending he was Poppaea. And now, years later, that laughter returned, sharper, crueler, echoed in Vitellius's halls as plans were made for his final performance. Vitellius's courtiers surely chuckled as they outlined the show. "He will enter veiled," one might have said, grinning as the words slid like a blade across the silence. "The people will roar with delight when the veil is lifted." Another, drunk on wine, might have added, "What greater jest than to give Rome the Empress it never had?" Their laughter would have filled the chamber, echoing against marble walls, sharpening the cruelty into theater. And somewhere in those same halls, Sporus listened, the trap closing around him. No chain bound him. No iron shackles dragged him toward the arena. His fate was more insidious. It relied not on force, but on assumption. For years, obedience had been carved into his flesh. He had learned to submit, to exist not as himself, but as the mask others forced upon him. Why should this be any different? Surely he would enter the arena, veiled and dressed, because that was what was demanded. But this time, Sporus broke the pattern. With the sand waiting, with the veil ready to be lowered over his face once more, he made his final choice. He chose not to step into the light of the arena. He chose not to let Rome's thousands feast on his humiliation. Instead, he embraced silence over mockery, darkness over the glare of torches and eyes. He took his own life, severing the thread before the empire could weave its last spectacle from his body. In that act, there was a kind of defiance. For the first time, the end of his story was written not with Nero's hand, nor Vitellius's decree, but with his own. His life had been stolen, remade, and paraded, but his death, his final breath, was his alone. The crowd never saw its parody of a bride. The torches lit for the ceremony sputtered and went out, unneeded. The arena's sand remained unstained by his humiliation, and Vitellius himself would soon fall, torn apart not by foreign enemies but by the same Roman mob he had once entertained. The cruelty he had planned for Sporus returned upon him tenfold, and history devoured him as it had Nero before. And Sporus. His name slipped into the shadows of history. He was remembered not as a man, nor even as a boy, but as a reflection, an echo, a life erased by another's grief, another's cruelty, another's hunger for spectacle. His story survived not because Rome cherished it, but because Rome could not look away from its own reflection in him. But Rome itself did not escape unmarked. What does it mean that an empire could witness such transformations, such mutilations, such humiliations, and stand silent? What does it reveal about a people who applauded as a child, was stolen from himself, clothed in the garments of the dead, and marched toward destruction? Sporus's story lingers because it is not only his, it is Rome's, it is power's, it is ours. And in the end, there was no bride in the arena, only the absence of one. In that absence lies the silence of history, pressing close, whispering not only of what was, but of what was allowed to be.